Schmidt's wedding ring lay in the mud beside torn clothes and boot prints that changed halfway down the path. The prints started human. They ended with claws. Something howled from the ridge above our camp. It was not a wolf. The sound carried Schmidt's voice inside it. I still remember the taste of pine resin that winter in 1854 and how it stuck to everything we touched. We worked deep in the Black Forest, cutting old-growth timber for the Baden railway. Fog never lifted. Church bells rang from villages we could not see. Our crew numbered 12 men. I kept the timber count and marked the trees for felling. Klaus Schmidt was our foreman, a broad man with a thick beard and steady hands who had worked these forests since he was a boy. His wife lived in Triberg, 3 valleys over, and he walked home every second Sunday without fail. Müller and his younger brother Hans worked the 2-man saw and could drop a pine in the exact direction they called. Werner sharpened axes and kept the tools in order. Old Johann, who had gray in his beard and scars on his forearms, handled the draft horses and knew every logging road in the Schwarzwald. The rest were steady men, whose names I recorded each morning in the ledger. We lived in a camp of canvas tents and rough timber shelters built against the wind. A central fire pit burned day and night, though the damp wood gave more smoke than heat. We ate black bread, smoked pork, and turnip stew from a shared pot. The cold bit through our wool coats, and frost settled into our bones no matter how close we sat to the fire. Each morning before dawn, we drank weak coffee and walked the narrow trail to the cutting site, our breath hanging white in the air. The forest here was old. The pines grew straight and tall, their trunks thick enough that 2 men could not reach around them. The canopy blocked most of the light, and the ground beneath lay covered in a bed of brown needles that muffled our footsteps. Fog drifted between the trunks and never fully burned away, even at midday. The air smelled of damp earth, resin, and rot. Birds called from high branches we could not see. Sometimes we heard the church bells from Triberg or Schonach, faint and distorted by the valley walls, but we never saw the villages themselves. We had been cutting for 3 weeks when the first strangeness occurred. It was a small thing, easy to dismiss. Werner reported that his best axe had gone missing from the tool rack overnight. He had checked it himself before turning in, he said, and set it blade down in its proper place. In the morning it was gone. We searched the camp and found it an hour later, buried point first in the trunk of a pine, 50 paces beyond the clearing. The handle showed teeth marks, deep grooves that did not match any tool we carried. Werner pulled the axe free and examined the bite pattern. He said nothing, but his jaw worked as though chewing words he did not want to speak. Old Johann looked at the marks and spat into the dirt. He muttered something in the dialect his grandmother had taught him, a tongue none of us understood. When Klaus asked what he said, Johann shook his head and walked back to the horses. That night, the dogs grew restless. We kept 3 mutts in camp to warn us of boar or lynx. They were scrappy animals, used to the forest and unafraid of shadows. But that night they whined and paced, and would not settle near the fire. One of them, a brindled bitch with a torn ear, stared into the trees and growled low in her throat. Her hackles stood straight, and her body stayed rigid for nearly an hour. When Klaus threw a stick toward the darkness to see what held her attention, she yelped and bolted into the tent line. She did not come out until morning. The second oddity came 2 days later. We found tracks in the clearing where we stacked the cut timber. They were boot prints at first, clear and deep, pressed into soft mud near the water barrel. But halfway across the clearing, the prints changed. The heel deepened, the toes lengthened and split, By the time the trail reached the forest edge, they were no longer human. They showed claws and a gait too wide for any man. Müller crouched beside the prince and measured them with his hand. He looked up at his brother Hans, and neither spoke. Werner suggested it was a prank, that one of the men had carved wooden claws and pressed them into the mud for a joke. But the depth of the impressions was wrong. Whatever made those tracks had weight and power. Klaus ordered us back to work and told us not to speak of it to the others. Fear spreads faster than fire in a camp this far from help. We worked through the morning in silence. The saws bit into wood with a steady rhythm. The axes rang sharp and clean. Timber fell with heavy crashes that echoed off the valley walls. By midday, we had felled 6 trees and begun the limbing. The work was hard and required focus, and for a few hours the strangeness seemed distant. It was Hans who noticed Schmidt was missing. We had broken for a cold meal, and the men gathered near the fire to eat bread and sausage. Hans counted heads twice, and then walked the perimeter calling Schmidt's name. No answer came. Klaus set down his food and organized a search. We spread out in pairs, calling and listening. The fog had thickened, and visibility dropped to 20 paces. I walked with Werner through a stand of young pine, where the undergrowth grew dense. We called Schmidt's name, and heard only our own voices bouncing back from the trees. Then Werner stopped and raised his hand. He pointed to the ground. A single boot print, fresh and deep, pressed into the moss. Beside it lay a brass button from a work coat. Werner picked it up and turned it over in his palm. It was Schmidt's. He wore a coat with buttons like that, stamped with a mill mark from Freiburg. We followed the prints for another 100 paces. They led downhill toward a rocky outcrop where the trees thinned, the ground turned to stone, and the prints vanished. We stood at the edge of the outcrop and called again. No reply. The forest felt too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. Werner looked at me and said we should go back. His voice was steady, but his hand shook when he pocketed the button. When we returned to camp, Klaus had gathered the others. No one had found Schmidt. The sun was already low, and the light filtering through the canopy had turned gray and cold. Klaus made a decision. We would search until full dark, then return to camp and resume at first light. No man would go alone. No one would stray beyond shouting distance. We searched until we could no longer see the ground in front of us. The forest at night became a different place. Sounds carried strangely. A branch breaking nearby sounded like it came from across the valley. Twice I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find nothing. My breath came fast, and my fingers ached from gripping the axe handle too tight. Back at camp, we built the fire high and sat close to it. No one spoke much. Old Johann fed the horses and checked their tethers 3 times. The dogs refused to leave the center of camp and lay pressed against each other near the flames. Klaus stood at the edge of the firelight with his arms crossed, staring into the dark. His jaw was set, and his eyes did not blink. Müller broke the silence. He said that his grandmother, who had lived in these woods her whole life, told stories of men who went into the forest and did not come back as themselves. She said there were old curses in the Schwarzwald, older than the church, older than the Roman roads. She said some men carried a sickness in their blood that the forest could wake. Klaus told him to stop. He said we would not fill our heads with old wives' tales. Schmidt had wandered off or fallen into a ravine. We would find him in the morning, injured but alive. He spoke with certainty, but I saw the tightness in his shoulders and the way his hand kept moving to the knife on his belt. We took turns on watch. 2 men stayed awake while the others tried to sleep. I drew the second watch with Werner. We sat near the fire and listened to the night sounds. An owl called from somewhere high in the canopy. Small creatures moved through the underbrush. Once we heard a long, low howl from the ridge above camp. It started deep and animal, then shifted higher, almost human at the end. Werner gripped his axe and stared up the slope. The howl did not repeat. At dawn, we resumed the search. Klaus divided us into 3 groups. He took Müller and Hans and headed east along the logging road. Johann and 2 others went west toward the stream. I went south with Werner and a young man named Peter, who had barely spoken since Schmidt's disappearance. We walked for an hour through dense fog. The ground rose and fell in ridges covered with fern and moss. Twice we found broken branches and disturbed earth that suggested something large had passed through, but the tracks were unclear. Peter called out once, his voice cracking. He pointed to a tree where deep claw marks scored the bark from root to shoulder height. The cuts were fresh. Sap still oozed from the wounds. Werner examined the marks. He placed his hand inside one of the gouges. His fingers did not reach the deepest part. He looked at me and said nothing, but his face had gone pale. We moved on, our steps slower and more cautious. It was Peter who found the clearing. He had pushed ahead through a thicket of young spruce and called back for us to come quickly. When we broke through, we stopped at once. The clearing was small, no more than 30 paces across. The ground was torn and muddy. In the center lay torn clothing and a single leather boot. Beside them, pressed deep into the earth, was the wedding ring. I recognized it immediately. Schmidt wore that ring every day. It was simple brass, worn smooth by years of labor. I crouched and picked it up. The metal was cold and felt heavier than it should. Beside the ring, the boot prints began. They started as human steps, clear and even. Halfway across the clearing, they changed. The stride lengthened. The shape shifted. By the time they reached the far edge of the clearing, they were no longer human at all. Werner walked the trail, his eyes on the ground. He stopped where the transformation was complete and knelt to study the final print. It was massive, broader than his own boot, with 4 long toes ending in deep claw marks. The print pressed into the mud with weight that suggested something far heavier than a man. Peter stood at the edge of the clearing and would not come closer. He asked if we should go back and bring Klaus. I nodded. Werner stayed where he was, staring at the tracks. I walked over and touched his shoulder. He flinched and then stood slowly. His hands were shaking. We returned to camp and found Klaus already there. The other groups had found nothing. When I handed him the ring, his face went rigid. He held it up to the light and turned it over, as though hoping it might not be Schmidt's. But he knew. We all knew. Klaus made a decision. We would pack the camp and leave at first light. The railway could find another crew. Whatever had taken Schmidt, whether animal or man, was too dangerous to face with axes and saws. We would report to the company office in Triberg and let the authorities handle it. The men moved quickly to break down the tents and load the wagons. No one argued. No one asked questions. The relief on their faces was clear. Johann hitched the horses and lashed down the equipment with tight knots. By late afternoon, the camp was nearly packed. That was when the howl came again. It started low, from the ridge to the north, and rose in pitch until it sounded almost like a scream. Then it stopped abruptly, and silence fell. Every man froze where he stood. The dogs began to bark, sharp and frantic. and then all three bolted into the forest. We did not see them again. Klaus ordered everyone to the center of camp. We formed a loose circle, each man holding whatever tool or weapon was nearest. The sun had dropped below the ridge, and the light was fading fast. Shadows stretched long across the clearing. The fire still burned, but it seemed smaller now, less able to push back the dark. Then we saw it. Movement at the tree line, low and deliberate. A shape emerged from the fog, walking on two legs but hunched forward, its arms too long and hanging nearly to the ground. It stepped into the clearing and stopped 30 paces from the fire. The light caught its face, and I saw features that were neither fully wolf nor fully man. The jaw was elongated, the teeth visible even with the mouth closed. The eyes were pale and reflected the firelight in a way that made my stomach turn. But it was the recognition in those eyes that stopped my breath. It knew us. It looked from man to man, its gaze steady and intelligent. When it looked at Klaus, it paused. Its head tilted slightly, and a low sound came from its throat. Not a growl, but something closer to speech, broken and wet. Klaus took a step forward. His face had gone white. He whispered a single word. Schmidt. The creature's lips pulled back, and I saw the wedding ring still on its clawed hand. The metal caught the firelight and glinted once, before the creature turned and stepped back into the trees. It moved without hurry, as though it knew we would not follow. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Miller dropped his axe and sat hard on the ground. His brother pulled him up, but Muller's legs would not hold him, and he slumped back down. Peter was crying, not loud, but in short, choked gasps. Werner stared at the place where the creature had stood, his jaw slack. Klaus turned to face us. His voice, when he spoke, was rough and low. He said we would leave now, in the dark, and not wait for morning. He said we would travel through the night and not stop until we reached the valley road. No one argued. We loaded the last of the equipment onto the wagons and started down the trail in near darkness. Old Johann led the horses, and the rest of us walked in a tight group, our eyes on the shadows. The trail wound downhill through dense forest. The fog pressed close, and visibility dropped to a few paces. We heard sounds around us, branches breaking, footsteps that matched our own pace. Once, I saw a shape moving parallel to us through the trees, tall and hunched. When I stopped to look, it stopped as well. I did not mention it to the others. I did not need to. They had seen it too. We walked for hours. My legs ached, and my breath came hard from the pace Klaus set. No one complained. The alternative was worse. Twice, the howl rose from behind us, closer each time. The second time, it was answered by another howl from ahead, cutting off our path. Klaus adjusted our course to the west, away from both sounds. The detour would add hours to our journey, but none of us suggested another route. Near midnight, we reached a narrow clearing where a stream cut across the trail. Klaus called a halt. The horses needed water, and the men were stumbling from exhaustion. We formed a tight perimeter and built no fire. We drank from the stream and ate what food remained in our packs. No one spoke above a whisper. Old Johann sat beside me and pulled a small carved figure from his coat pocket. It was rough-hewn, shaped like a man with antlers. He set it on a rock beside the stream and whispered words I did not understand. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was leaving an offering for safe passage. His grandmother had taught him that the old things in the forest could be bargained with, if you knew the right words. I did not laugh. I watched him finish his prayer and hoped he was right. We rested for less than an hour. Then Klaus stood and ordered us back on the trail. The path from here descended steeply, and the footing was treacherous in the dark. We moved slowly, each man gripping the shoulder of the man ahead. The horses strained against the load, and the wagon wheels groaned on the uneven ground. As we descended, the fog began to thin. The trees grew shorter, and gaps appeared in the canopy. I saw stars above us for the first time in weeks. The air felt less heavy, less suffocating. I allowed myself to believe we might reach the valley road before dawn. Then Miller screamed. It was a short, sharp sound, cut off almost as soon as it began. I turned and saw him on the ground, his brother kneeling beside him. Hans was shouting, but I could not make out the words over the sudden chaos as men rushed toward them. Klaus pushed through and held up his lantern. Miller's leg was torn open from knee to ankle, 3 deep gashes that bled heavily into the dirt. He gasped and gripped his brother's arm, his face twisted in pain. We saw nothing in the darkness around us, but we all felt it. The presence, the weight of something watching from just beyond the light. Klaus barked orders. 2 men lifted Müller and carried him toward the wagon. Werner and I stood back to back with our axes raised. Old Johann unhitched one of the horses and mounted it bareback, kicking it into motion down the trail ahead of us. He would ride for help, he said, and return with men from the village. We followed as fast as we could with the injured man. Müller's blood left a trail on the ground, dark and wet. I did not look back, but I heard movement behind us, branches snapping, stones skittering down the slope. The pace was brutal. My lungs burned and my legs trembled, but I did not slow. None of us did. The trail widened as we descended. The trees gave way to open meadow, and I saw lights in the distance. Triberg. The village sat in the valley below, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the night. Relief flooded through me so suddenly that my knees nearly buckled. We stumbled into the village near dawn. The church bells were ringing for early mass, and a few villagers were already moving through the streets. They stopped and stared as we came down the road, bloody and exhausted, our eyes wild. Klaus shouted for a doctor, and 2 men ran to fetch him. We carried Müller into the inn and laid him on a table. The innkeeper's wife brought water and cloth, and we cleaned the wound as best we could. The doctor arrived within minutes. He was an old man with steady hands and a calm voice. He examined Müller's leg and said the cuts were deep but clean. He could stitch them closed, but infection was likely. He worked quickly, and Müller bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. When it was done, the doctor wrapped the leg tightly and gave Müller a draught of something bitter to dull the pain. Klaus spoke with the village magistrate, a thin man with wire spectacles who listened without expression. Klaus told him everything: the missing Foreman, the tracks, the creature in the clearing. The magistrate wrote it all down in a ledger, his pen scratching across the page in neat, even strokes. When Klaus finished, the magistrate set down his pen and folded his hands. He said that Schmidt had likely been attacked by a wolf or boar, and that grief and exhaustion had caused Klaus to see things that were not there. He said that the Schwarzwald was dangerous, and logging crews sometimes lost men to accidents or animals. He said he would note the incident in his records and send word to the railway company. He thanked us for our report and suggested we rest before returning to our homes. Klaus did not argue. He looked at the magistrate for a long moment, then nodded and walked out. We followed him to the inn, where the innkeeper had set aside a room for us. We collapsed onto the beds and slept through the day and into the next night. When I woke, the room was dark and cold. The fire had gone out, and frost edged the window glass. I sat up slowly and found Klaus sitting by the window, staring out at the forest on the ridge above the village. He did not turn when I stood and walked over to him. I asked if he believed the magistrate. Klaus shook his head. He said Schmidt was still out there, somewhere in the trees. He said the ring proved it. He said he did not know what had happened to his friend, but he knew it was not natural. He said the old stories his grandmother told were not just stories. I asked what he would do. Klaus said he would leave Triberg and not return to the Schwarzwald. He said his wife deserved a husband who could sleep at night without waking in fear. He said he would find work in another valley, far from these woods, and try to forget. But I saw in his eyes that he would not forget. None of us would. I am 73 now. I left Baden that spring and moved north to Prussia. Klaus died in 1868 of heart failure. Müller lost his leg to infection and lived as a cripple until 1871. His brother Hans never spoke again after that night. Old Johann returned to the forest alone one autumn and was never seen again. The railway abandoned that stretch of the Schwarzwald. Maps mark it as restricted land. Local hunters avoid the ridge. I kept Schmidt's wedding ring. I look at it sometimes and remember the eyes that watched us from the dark. What we saw was real, and it still walks those woods. If this account from the Black Forest in 1854 disturbed you, please leave a like and help others discover these forgotten encounters. Subscribe to Dust and Bones for more historical horror stories from loggers, miners, soldiers, and explorers who faced the unknown. Drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. Next time, we journey to the Alaskan wilderness, where gold dredge workers swore they heard a drowned man calling from the ice. You will not want to miss it. Until then, remember that some places should remain undisturbed.